Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Wall Street has long been synonymous with power, money, and masculinity. But beneath the surface of this boys' club, a different story has been unfolding. One of determination, resilience, and gradual change. It's a hidden history of Wall Street that reveals the untold struggle and triumphs of women in finance. To uncover this narrative, I'm joined today by Paulina Bren, the author of She-Wolves, The Untold Story of Women on Wall Street. Paulina is an award-winning historian and professor at Vassar College, where she teaches international gender and media studies. In her new book, she takes us on a journey from the swinging 60s to the dawn of the 21st century, revealing how women fought their way into the corridors of financial power. It's a story of pioneers and trailblazers, of obstacles overcome and glass ceilings shattered. From the wise women who started as secretaries and became savvy investors, to the first female graduates of Harvard Business School who faced an uphill battle in a male-dominated industry. Bren's work brings to light fascinating and often shocking details. The absence of women's restrooms on the New York Stock Exchange floor until Muriel Siebert demanded change. The blatant discrimination that led to landmark lawsuits and the persistence of boys' club culture. This isn't just a story about Wall Street. It's a mirror reflecting the broader struggle for equality in American society. It's also how the women's movement, technological changes, and shifting social norms all played a role in reshaping the financial industry. It is my pleasure to welcome Paulina Bren here to talk about She-Wolves, the untold history of women on Wall Street. Paulina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. That was an incredible intro. I think I need a copy of that.
Well, thank
It
you
was
so much.
spot on. Excellent.
Well, thank you so much. Is there a turning point? Was there a single point, perhaps in the 60s, when suddenly there was an awareness that women were going to play a larger role in finance and on Wall Street?
Well, I think there was a formal awareness, but not an awareness that truly penetrated. So when I say a formal awareness is because, for example, Harvard Business School let their first 8 women into the MBA program in 1963, but it was done with tremendous reluctance, and the women there, the 8 women, had a very hard time. They were questioned constantly why they were there, why they were taking the spot of a real breadwinner. And of course, in the second year, in the spring, when the recruiters came to campus, which is sort of the moment that is a crescendo of one's MBA experience where you get the job, the recruiters wouldn't even talk to them. The women would try to sign up for interviews using their initials, and they'd sort of sheepishly walk in and they'd have to walk out. They were told they're not hiring women, and that's that. The professors were no less welcoming, I should say. And so there was a formal recognition that equality had to come, but that didn't really translate, of course. And in a sense, what was happening was these women who were getting the first MBAs from Harvard Business School didn't even have really that much of a leg up from the women who were taking the other route onto Wall Street, which was as secretaries and receptionists in the 1950s, especially the 1960s. And they started to sort of look, listen, watch, and learn. And sometimes they managed to indeed get that foothold and rise above the role of receptionist and secretary.
One interesting thing about the class at Harvard Business School
Mm-hmm.
is that it seemed to be a self-selecting population, and because of that, it was a group that should have been inherently more ambitious, inherently more willing to take risks to try and climb that ladder, or at least to begin.
Right. And in fact, it tells you how bad the treatment was, because when the admissions office was told that they were going to bring in their first group of women, they in fact had the mandate that they had to pick women who were so academically superb and talented altogether that there'd be no chance that they could fail out of Harvard Business School. So none of them failed, but it gives you a sense of even with that ambition, that drive, um, the culture in which they were then, let into to some extent, um, it was that difficult to sort of maneuver. Um, so I think that really tells us something, that these were women who were handpicked in order to succeed and struggle to succeed.
Was there a competition in some respects between the women that came up through business schools, like this early class at Harvard and subsequent classes, and those that made it, that were, as you say, secretaries and assistants, and listened carefully and worked their way up that way? Was there almost a jealousy between those two groups?
Absolutely, but it didn't happen until the early 1980s. So the first group of pioneering women who scaled the wall of Wall Street in the 1960s and 70s, some were college graduates, but a lot of them were also college dropouts. And they sort of had a tough veneer, a determination, I think, that you were maybe alluding to in terms of the Harvard Business School students. But these women, in some ways, were a bit more scrappy, and streetwise, and they could navigate the harassment, the remarks, and so forth. I think a little bit better. And not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them, they started to climb that rung. They managed to look away, evade the difficulties as much as possible, and they started to rise. Particularly, it was research analysis. That was the key. So there were two things that allowed these first pioneering women to make it. One was Wall Street looked so different in those days. In the 60s, I was really struck by this. It was very quaint, provincial. Everyone knew everybody, because even though there were sort of the major firms that we know today, there were hundreds of small brokerage houses. And this is where the women started. So that was one thing. The other thing was, when they moved out of the sort of clerical secretarial roles, usually the first step, pretty much for everybody, was research analysis, meaning that they were in charge of looking at a particular sector, industry, learn everything they could about it, and they would recommend stock. And the thing is, it was a wonderful place for them to be, because one, the research departments had always been seen as very feminized. The big money was with trading. Um, and the men who were sitting in research were therefore seen as sort of already, nerdy and feminized. So women was, to some extent, able to get their foot in that door. And also the reports that they were writing, they would sign off with initials. So it would be years before somebody realized they were taking the market advice of women. So that was one thing. This is what the early women did to get somewhere on Wall Street. And that rift you mentioned really starts to happen in around 1980, 81, when Wall Street just changes radically. It becomes a gold rush, the Reagan Revolution. Now you have women coming in droves because Wall Street needs bodies, and they're less discriminatory about whose body is going to be there. So that's, first of all, you have droves of women, and they're a very different type of woman. They are graduates of the Ivy Leagues. At that point in the 1980s, I mean, something like 70% of graduates, they're heading to Wall Street. This would be unheard of before. And also you have more and more women who are in MBA programs, and they're also coming to Wall Street. And these early women are definitely looking at them with frustration. On the one hand, a lot of these women do have MBAs, and they have those Ivy League degrees, and there is certainly some jealousy. But there's definitely a feeling that from these early women, and they certainly told me about it, that they felt that their work was not appreciated, that they had done the groundwork, right? That they had created this environment where these women could now come, and they were not being appreciated. And the second generation, in talking to them, they very much saw the early generation as manly, unfriendly. They wanted nothing to do with them. So this is when you really see the friction.
And when you had that period in the 80s where you had these different generations, the ones that came up as secretaries, the early ones that came out of
Hmm.
business schools, plus the larger group that was coming in the 80s, and they all were interacting with each other. How did the men at the time view this, particularly given the diversity and the inherent conflicts between these groups of women?
Right. It's it's interesting because Janet Hansen, for example, who actually she came out of business school, but in the late 70s, and then she was struck by the fact that as more and more women were arriving a few years later, that almost what her feeling was that when there were so few women, you could fly under the radar to some extent in terms of unpleasant attention. But as soon as there were more women, she felt that everybody was seen as prey. That was her view on it. So other women would say, well, what shifted was obviously you're also looking at the 1980s. Two things have happened. One is that one of the reasons Wall Street was so sort of quaint and provincial is because New York Stock Exchange member firms, they were partnerships until 1970 and then only gradually became public companies, stockholder companies. And so indeed, that it was partners, and so it was very intimate. That stockholders weren't in the picture as much. So as companies become public, uh, they also have to abide by other rules, right? So there are more women, there is sort of the sense of some more equality happening. So that's happening on the one hand, but women would often say, well, in the 70s, men would make comments about my my breasts. And in the 80s, they knew they couldn't. As I say, new rules were in place. But what they did simply, they had a conversation with you, but they were looking at your breasts the whole time. So basically, these sorts of things shifted. There was an understanding that certain things were off limits, but it didn't change the culture in the least. Um, so we see shifts, we see change, but we don't see any real transformation at the same time.
Was there a nexus, an awareness, any kind of relationship to the changes that were taking place, particularly in New York, in other industries that were happening in the advertising business, in law firms, in fashion and publishing, etc.?
Right. Well, what I'd say about that is when you think about more recently the Me Too movement, what is the one industry where there wasn't a Me Too movement? It was really on Wall Street, right? So, and a lot of the women who got out of Wall Street and went to other industries, they did say, it wasn't that much better, frankly. And I think that's a reality. This is She-Wolves is the story of the women who scaled this wall from the 1960s through 9/11. But in many ways, I found myself thinking while I was writing it, and I didn't think I would necessarily, I have nothing to do with finance. I didn't think I was just fascinated by this. I didn't think I could really necessarily relate. I wasn't expecting to relate to these women, but I started to realize that what I'm also writing is the story of all women who came to adulthood and into the workplace in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. They have all they all see something in this that is very recognizable to them. And I was just giving a talk last week, and a woman came up to me. She'd actually worked in publishing, and she said that just listening to this, it was great, but it was very triggering. She almost had to leave. So uh, I would always use the caveat and say, we're talking about a time when I think there's a moment now we should be looking back and really evaluating this, and it's a story across the board. That said, Wall Street has money and power in a way that you just don't see elsewhere, right? And so it just revs this up. And this is obviously also why, and the silence of Wall Street is astonishing, the secrets. And so that's why we didn't see a Me Too movement. Um, and speaking of that power aspect, there's a wonderful character in my book called Marianne Spraggins. And she was a successful law professor, a longtime New Yorker. She came from a family of Black activism and city hall power in New York, and everything was fine. But she was a law professor, and she abandoned her professorship because in 1980 she felt the allure of Wall Street, and it was because she took a course as part of she did an advanced degree then in law at Harvard, and she took a course on international business transactions, and there was a point where the professor took the class to, as she said, the bowels of Wall Street, and it was 1980, and she suddenly she felt she knew power her whole life. She could recognize power, but this was a power she hadn't encountered yet. She understood that this was where things were going to happen, and a Black woman should have a real place at the table. And so she embarked on a very difficult to begin with career on Wall Street. So I think, this is just an example of how, yes, what is happening there is happening elsewhere, but at a tempo and sort of um, concentration on Wall Street that you're probably not seeing elsewhere.
And because it started as early as it did and made these leaps that you're talking about, that you had women that were not just part of a different generation in terms of how they arrived at Wall Street, but really part of different generations in where they came from. The ones that came out of the 60s, ones that came of age in the late 70s and 80s into the 90s were very different in terms of the cultural backdrop.
So different. And this is moment in 1977 where John Malloy publishes the Woman's Dress for Success book. It becomes a huge bestseller. And what it is the first guidebook, sort of manual on how women in finance in the workplace should dress. And this happens in 1977 because literally, I mean, I talked to so many women who they were coming from the outer boroughs of New York. The more typical profile was somebody who was sort of lower middle class. And John Malloy, in the Dress for Success book for women, completely understands that. And it's really a guidebook about how to pass for upper middle class. And he keeps talking about that these are the successful people. And in order to succeed, you need to know how to look like them. And while critics were outraged by sort of the assumptions that he made in this book, it was a huge bestseller because before this, women indeed on Wall Street. I mean, I talked to women who, one woman who herself said she was wearing sort of hooker boots, those that tied above the knee to work. And when she was told she had to dress better, she headed off to the library to try to find any guidance on how to dress, and she couldn't find anything. This was prior to John Malloy's book. Another woman who also from the outer boroughs was in sort of that was actually given a credit card by a boss and told to go and actually buy high-end clothes. And so this really was sort of a fascinating class study taking place as well. And when the Financial Women's Association, it's sort of the first, I mean, there was the Women's Bond Club, but the Financial Women's Association was created in the 1950s by the first very few women on Wall Street. And they said they did it for two reasons. One, they really needed people to go have lunch with. They had nobody to go to lunch with. So it was a networking thing, but obviously comradeship, friendship as well. And the other thing they found, they would bring in speakers And some of the most popular speakers were those who were literally saying, this is when you go to a business dinner, this is what it's going to look like. This is where the salad fork is, and so forth. And this is not to belittle these women at all, but to really sort of draw a picture of who this first generation was and sort of what techniques and came into play.
The other thing that's important to keep in mind, and particularly for younger women that are thinking about this today or listening to this, the idea that this wasn't just about what was going on in the workplace, that the workplace extended into many more social situations, lunches, dinners, private
Absolutely.
clubs, etc.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the thing about business. It always extends into social life. So that made it even more volatile. There were cases of women of sort of a client day at a golf course, which was fine. Women could play golf too, but then the golf courses turned out to be men only. And again, you could never react. You could never react in front of clients. And you couldn't sort of be that angry feminist. So it put people in a real bind, or it put women in a real bind because you had to play along these sorts of social setups um, that became obstacles, and you had to sort of approach them in a very neutral way because people were watching. And of course, then you had the flip side of clients and colleagues trying to make a pass at you. This happened all the time as well. So either you were excluded or you were included too much. So there was it's really remarkable the kind of minefield that these women were negotiating all the time. It was really, I mean, the talent involved in order to survive this and persevere and not leave Wall Street was remarkable. And you talk about sort of women on Wall Street today. I'm really excited for them to read this because I'm curious how they view this because certainly there was sort of the women who came in the 1980s and 1990s, they've also told me about the generation after that they would interview these young women to give them jobs, so they were already working with them as colleagues. And when they said anything about how they used to actually use femininity to their advantage, or and often they found if they were aggressive and too manlike, it didn't work. So they had to fall on these tricks of femininity. The younger generation sort of gasps at the very thought of it. Um, so there are three distinct generations, those early pioneers, the women coming in the 80s and 90s, and then sort of the 2000s more recent women in Wall Street. They've all had extremely different experiences and tensions.
One of the things that seems inescapable is that the talent required to walk that tightrope in those early days, and the effort that it took
Yeah.
was really in many ways some of the same talents and the same abilities that it took to succeed in the business itself.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. Um, the sad thing is women, every single woman, and again, another talk last week, a woman very proudly said the same thing, and I'd say 95% of women I spoke to said this, that they're very proud of how they deflected unwanted attention. And this, I mean, this starts in the 1950s and it goes through, you know, till certainly the end of my timeline of 9/11, 2001. Um, but they're very proud of how they deflect through humor because there was no other way to do that. And you became very skilled at being funny because you had to put off the man, the client, the colleague, the boss without offending them. Also, a lot of the time you were being watched to see your reaction, to see if you could hack it, if you were tough enough. So, for example, Alice Jarko was the first woman to actually trade on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, not to get a seat. The very first was Mickey Siebert, who got a seat in 1967, started January 1st, 1968. But almost 10 years later, 1976, Alice Jacko comes as a floor trader for Oppenheimer, the first woman to do so on the New York Stock Exchange. And she has to be convinced to do it because she knows it's not going to be pleasant. But it turns out to be far worse than she imagined, far worse. They have still those pneumatic tubes for stock quotes. She gets dildos instead. At some point, that she was receiving anonymous threatening phone calls. She needed actually a police escort. But every time she left her booth and she came back, there was something nasty left for her. And she said everybody was watching to see how she'd react. So your response had to be very measured. So as I say, these women, rightly so, became proud of how they were able to detract through humor.
Talk about Muriel Siebert and her influence.
Yes. So Muriel Mickey Siebert, if you've heard of any woman on Wall Street, it's going to be her. And in fact, I should say, because this is very much related to Mickey Siebert, she's probably the only woman anybody's ever heard of being on Wall Street prior to contemporary times. So much so, I was really struck by how all these amazing women's stories, you cannot find a single footprint of these women on the internet. You Google these women, you won't find them. Who you find is Mickey Siebert. And there, for example, there's a wonderful, quite recent book about the ups and downs of Wall Street over the past many decades. It's over 600 pages long. It's done through interviews with big shots on Wall Street. Out of 600 pages, there are only 2 pages where they interview a woman, and it's Mickey Siebert, and that is classic. So she was an iconoclast. She arrived in 1954 in New York, college dropout, in a beat-up Studebaker with $500 in her pocket. She applied for jobs. Well, first the UN, they turned her down, so then she turned to Wall Street. She then realized she has to lie that she actually has a college degree, which she did. And she got a job and she took that route that I was talking about. She started as an assistant in the research department. She was in charge of the teletype machine. And she watched and listened. She realized that, this is an art and a science. And that she could look, she said she could look at numbers and they would light up like a Broadway marquee for her. She understood them. And there was a moment where this would often happen in research departments where if they were doing really well, the research analysts could sort of just throw some of their work over to the underlings, the trainee underlings. So that's what happened. And Mickey Siebert got the airline industry from a train expert who didn't believe that there would be a sort of an expansion of air travel. And she became an expert research analyst in aviation. And but all the time, no matter what happened, she was so outsalaried, as all these women were, and are continue to be. She was so outsalaried by the incoming men, right, from business school, and she was the expert, but they were getting more money. And so she jumped from one small brokerage firm to another. She always got a promotion, she always got a salary raise, and then she was always outsalaried. And she also wanted to join one of the big firms, JP Morgan, so forth. No chance. They were absolutely not hiring women outside of the secretarial pool. And so finally, a friend of hers, who was a famous financier, Gerald Sy, he said, well, why don't you you're never going to get anywhere. There are dead ends everywhere for you. Why don't you just buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange? She said, what? Is that even possible? And she went home that night and she went through the constitution of the New York Stock Exchange. And sure enough, women were not barred, probably because nobody had foreseen that possibility. And so after 6 months, she sort of approached them, and there was a seat available for what's today $4 million. And she approached them and said, I want to buy this seat. Um, and they couldn't say no. But there were two major obstacles. One was getting a bank loan. This is the time when women can't get a credit card without a male signatory. And here she needs a massive bank loan. Some banks were willing to give a promissory note, but only if she was already given the seat. So it was a sort of a bind, a catch-22. Somebody had to sponsor her, and so the men who said they would always sponsor her, they would take a quick exit when they saw her. But she managed to pull it together, and she got that first seat. But she said, there's no way I'm going to go down on that floor and trade, because I will make more enemies than it's worth. And then a great moment was when she got the seat. So she started her own firm and used that seat to enlarge her firm. And her first advertisement, she billed herself as the first lady of the New York Stock Exchange. And the chairman said, no, no, no. By definition, my wife is the first lady of the New York Stock Exchange. So she had to change that. But she was amazing. And she was, not only the first of so many things, but she really supported women. She was a character. I mean, so many people have been in touch with me since She Wolves came out last week saying, "Oh, I knew Mickey. I have great stories about Mickey." She was quite the character. And she has, rightfully so, she has sort of the main stage in that story in many ways.
And it would be impossible to have the scope of this story without lawsuits. Talk a little bit
Yes,
about what some of the
yes.
fundamental key lawsuits were in this history.
Oh, well, it's more about the form. That's really the fascinating story. I don't know how many people know, but when you basically sign up to work on Wall Street, in your employee contract, it says that you sign away your rights to take any dispute or dissatisfaction to court, that you can only take it to arbitration. So what that means is you make a claim for harassment or inequality pay or something like that is chronic, consistent, you can't take it anymore, and you take it to arbitration. And it's a panel of 3 people who decide your case. They cannot force witnesses to come, unlike a court. There is no appeal. There are no reporters present. That's a huge thing. And they found that statistically, the people who sit on these panels are white men over the age of 65. And so you can imagine when a woman takes an arbitration claim, right? What happens? And there's a database, FINRA database. If you make a claim, your name is on it. If somebody makes a claim against you, your name is never on it. So I tell a story of a woman who took her case to arbitration, and it's horrible. And this is why these class action suits popped up in the 1990s. Famously, the Boom Boom Room. But basically, by women, it was the only way around arbitration. If women could come together for a class action suit, that was the way they could take a case to court. And they won. They consistently won throughout the 1990s. All these firms were brought to court, and these women won.
And finally, how much of this history is around today? But prior to your book, just the sense of this history among the women on Wall Street today. How much do they know about the shoulders that they stand on?
I think they know very little, because what I've been struck by, I mean, there's a whole literature of memoirs on Wall Street written by both men and women. But these are, they can be good, but they're accounts of a single person in a single moment. And there's always this, especially for the women who've written these memoirs, there seems to sort of be a surprise looking back of how could it have been that bad? Why did I tolerate that? Why did I go along with it? That sort of strange revelation. So a whole context and a timeline and the interweaving of multiple stories is missing. So it turns into just one person's story as opposed to an entire epic tale of what was going on Wall Street and these hidden women who are leading these lives, often very prosperous lives, but what they were going through, and how these stories actually play off each other. This is not the case of one woman. This is the case of this is the story of all these women. And I think in that case, it's really, in that sense, it's really unique. I mean, I didn't find any other book like this, which is frankly one of the reasons I wanted to write it.
Paulina Bren, her book is She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. Paulina, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.